Hey guys, Soul Closet here, back making another video, and today I'm going to be talking about more homebrew stuff. And the only time that I've talked about homebrew stuff on this channel before, in recent times, is my video about what happens when you buy or pirate a Wii U game. That video has a very controversial air to it. It's got a lot of views and a lot of likes and a lot of dislikes, and I think that's primarily because I was I don't know, the way I talked in that video made it sound like I really knew what I was talking about, but then I got things wrong. This video, not only am I admitting up front that I don't know everything, because I certainly don't, but also I'm not talking about anything as in-depth as that. So hopefully there's less for me to get wrong. If I do get something wrong, I'm totally willing to accept that. Just let me know in the comments, and, you know, unless you really hate me, don't dislike the video. No, I mean, you can if you want to. It's just whatever. That's irrelevant. So this video is going to be about Nintendo Homebrew on all the different Nintendo consoles that have Homebrew. The only one I'm excluding from this video is the Switch, and that's simply because its Homebrew at the moment is really nothing more than a WebKit browser exploit that lets you view the file system in certain parts. There may be more under wraps, but currently that's all that's publicly available, and I'm the public. So I'm not going to try to assume or do a ton of developer-based research on what might be further than that. I'm just going to take it out of this video for now. So I guess the first thing that we're going to have to do is take out the paper, like usual, and talk about what Homebrew really is. So what does it mean to be able to... Well, what is Homebrew? Homebrew is any software that you can run that was made by, I guess, the people who weren't intended to be making software. So, for example, when you've got, you know, I don't know, Kirby, right? You've got Kirby, and Kirby was made by Hal. I think that's who makes Kirby. Let's say that Kirby is made by Hal. And that's supposed to run on, let's say, the Wii. Right? Kirby's Epic Yarn. I don't know if that was made by Hal, but let's say it was. That's meant to run on the Wii, so that's good. As far as Nintendo's concerned, that's good. But then you get something like, what's a homebrew application on the Wii? SM64 multiplayer. You know, Mario 64 multiplayer mod. That is not official. That was not made by Nintendo, right? It was made by Skelix, I want to say. The guy who made Star Road. So, unofficial. So, according to Nintendo, not supposed to happen. However, both of them still converge running on the Wii. And that makes this official. And this Homebrew. Homebrew is software made by unintended developers without official licenses or sanctioning that still runs on the source system. At least that's the definition that we're working with in terms of Nintendo consoles for this video. And it doesn't have to just be games. It can be any software. A lot of homebrew software has a general purpose towards hacking the console, basically taking advantage of exploits in its, you know, Nintendo distributed firmware on a certain version, perhaps in conjunction with hardware modifications in some cases, to ultimately achieve more, indie developer access to the console's hardware, so that you can do things like, well, for a lot of people, run illegal games. That's not a focus here. We're talking about Homebrew itself. So, how do you get Homebrew on something like the Wii? Well, I'm going to go in chronological order here, and the first Nintendo console that has Homebrew in our current console modding, you know, soft modding sense is the GameCube. I'm going to abbreviate it as GCN, because that's the standard abbreviation. So, normal GameCube game fare, let's say a real game, like 007 Agent Under Fire. You know, we've got, you know, a James Bond game, and it was made by whoever made that game. I don't know. And it is, you know, it's developed. So it's developed, and then It's published. I don't know who published it. I think Activision. So let's just title that Acts. So published. And then it is distributed to the GameCube in stores, right? So, you know, that's a real game. A real officially licensed and sanctioned title for the GameCube. So how do you get homebrew software and potentially homebrew games to run on a GameCube? Simply put, basically, you take, ironically, 007 Agent Under Fire. That was just the first game I thought of, but it's also an exploit. So in this particular instance, you take that game and you make a save file. So let's just say you have a, so I'm going to make another line here. Let's say you have a save, right? So you've got your save, and this is good. This is a normal save. You've done nothing to modify it. It's just a normal game save playing 007. But then you take it from your memory card. So let's mem card, and you put it into a Wii. Okay, so this is like the middleman here. I don't know why, but the middleman is a squiggly line. So you put it into a Wii, and you have to have Homebrew on the Wii, and we'll get into how that works in a couple minutes here. So you have to have Homebrew, and then you modify the save. And what you're basically doing is you're taking advantage of an exploit in the way that 007 Agent Under Fire loads its save file, and you are putting stuff in the save file that can basically overflow a certain running space in the code for Agent Under Fire and allowing it to run arbitrary code off of the modified save file on the memory card. So you take the modified save, you put it back into the game. So let's put the game here. And then you bring it back out, and that lets you run arbitrary code. Arbitrary code execution, ACE. And once you have ACE, you can, and this is simplifying, but once you have ACE, you can run Homebrew, right? Homebrew is arbitrary code unintended to be run. So when you can run arbitrary code, you can run Homebrew. Again, I know that's not always correct, but I'm gonna, expound upon that. So we've got that on the GameCube. But for the GameCube hacking, you have to have a, modified Wii. So how do you modify the Wii? New page. Hey, this one's all covered in dots here. Let me flip it around. So you've got yourself a Wii. A nice old official Nintendo Wii. And the most common way to exploit a Wii for homebrew purposes is using something called the Hack Me installer. And just like all homebrew for the Wii, everything has I for me, so just like Wii. So you want to use the Hack Me, I'm just going to call it HM. You want to use the Hack Me installer to install Homebrew. So that goes here, and it ends up here, but what's in the middle? Well, it's something called Letterbomb. And the way that Letterbomb works is it basically, you take the MAC address. If you're not familiar with the MAC address, it's a network identifier that's specific to a certain piece of hardware, so that when multiple pieces of hardware are on the same wireless or wired, network, they can be differentiated. But what Letterbomb does is it takes so Letterbomb is the middleman, squiggly line. But Letterbomb takes the MAC address and does a function on it to give you some files. So, files. And, for the sake of, being concise and ambiguous, those files, when they are put on your SD card, will be read by the Wii as mail on your message board, which is a pretty underused feature of the original Wii. But you click on it, you open it, and exploits. There's an exploit in that particular thing that you open by clicking on the mail, and boom, it will then load Hack Me. It will install the Homebrew channel, HPC, onto your Wii, and then you have Ace. Hey, you can run whatever. I mean, this is already arbitrary code, but with this, it makes it more user accessible by being able to install things as if they were programs. So that's how it works on the Wii. And you would then use that to install a GameCube memory card program, and then that's what lets you do GameCube hacks. So that's how GameCube hacking works as an extension of how Wii hacking works. So we've got the GameCube and Wii, because they're kind of linked in a way, since they have, you know, shared things in terms of hacking. But what about the handhelds? So let's start with the original DS. I'm gonna put some more paper under here so I don't get all sorts of marks on my desk. So what about the original DS and the DSi? Well, there was a lot of work in between 2006 and 2008 or 9 or so on DS Homebrew, and it's pretty open by now. If you have an original DS, it's going to be pretty slow and kind of, you know, limited, but there's lots of things you can do with DS Homebrew. And the way that it generally works is, for the DS, you know, as we said before, for any console, there are games. So I'm just going to put, I don't know, Pokemon in this example. And it gets developed by an official dev, in this case, Game Freak, but whatever. Gets published by, actually, Nintendo. So, middleman. And then it is distributed legally and on normal markets to the DS owners. Okay, fine. That's how games are normally distributed. However, people wanted to play illegal games, and people wanted to play their illegal games on more condensed storage, because they didn't want to carry around 30 or 40 DS carts if they wanted to play 30 or 40 DS games. I'm not much of a collector myself, but tons of people are, and a lot of people loved the original DS, myself included. So they wanted lots of games. So let's just call that lots. They wanted lots of games that were officially developed, right? And published and all that. But how do you get them to the DS? Well, it's something called a flash cart. And if you're not familiar with what a flash cart is, it's basically a normal cartridge, in this case for the DS. That's just a normal cart, but it has a slot in it. And that slot is a micro SD card slot. And micro SD, as I'm sure you're all aware, very small condensed storage, numbering in the gigabytes, whereas each DS game, in this case, is only, I don't know, a maximum of 80 megabytes, I think. I think is the biggest DS game, roughly. And so you could take legal or illegal ROMs, you know, dumps of the official game cartridges, put them on your computer to a micro SD card, put that in this flash cart, and then put that in your DS. And that's how you would get lots of games in one package. You never have to carry around a bag with you. However, people started realizing that between flash carts and cheating devices, like the Action Replay, AR, that had micro SD card slots, you could run essentially custom firmware on these, because they ran their own programs from the cart slot on the DS. They ran their own code. And so if there were exploits or, you know, officially sanctioned available tools for these flash carts and cheating devices that would let you run your own code from the micro SD card slot, as well as the games that you've dumped, then you can run whatever you want. And that's the basis for DS Homebrew. Essentially, you've got a flash cart, and it has a micro SD slot. You put files, again, being ambiguous, on the micro SD, and it lets you run arbitrary stuff on the DS. I know I'm misusing ACE in this video, but I'm trying to get a point across, so don't get all snippy. I know I'm misusing the term to an extent, But, you know, anyway, that aside, that's how DS hacking works. The DSi, the exploits were a little bit different, and lots of development work had to be done relative to the faster processor and different screen resolution and cameras and anything else you wanted to implement, as well as a bit better security. But it's essentially the same process. It's just that DSi hacking got patched, whereas DS hacking really didn't, for the most part. So that kind of leads us in a way, to the 3DS. The 3DS is, I would argue, the most complex and interesting of all of the Nintendo consoles in terms of quote-unquote hacking and homebrew. In the earlier days of 3DS homebrew, well, the very early days, it was, you know, there were lots of exploits, but people either didn't know about them yet, or developers didn't know how to make things to run. So even though they knew how to run things, they didn't know what to make or how to do so. But let's, you know, skip ahead from that part. And let's start with something... Well, let's start with the idea of homebrew, right? So homebrew is stuff, as I said before, it's a program or software in general that you can run on the console that was developed by an independent person and was not intended to be run, basically speaking. But on the 3DS and on more sophisticated consoles now, as well as computers and lots of other things, but, you know, in general, programs have permissions. And this is where it gets interesting, is that homebrew, in the traditional, you know, Wii, GameCube, DS sense, has pretty much always been able to run on the 3DS using a number of entry points. I'm going to call those EPs. Haha, music. Haha. Squiggly line. So you've got entry points. And what entry points are, in terms of 3DS hacking, are some exploit in the user land, which is basically anything the normal, unmodified, unhacked user can access, that let you run code with the user permissions. And that has its limitations. Homebrew run through just an entry point with no other modifications only has the same permissions as a user sitting around on the home menu. So let's call that like level 1 permissions. You know, not good. You don't really want level 1 permissions. It helps you. Yeah, you can play a bad port of Doom. You can emulate a Game Boy Color. You can make your own custom home menu theme. But it's pretty limited in terms of what you can really do and how much power you have at your disposal. Because the 3DS isn't using its full range of power, and isn't allowed to, when it's just sitting around on the home menu or in something like the DS camera or sound application. It just doesn't need it, so it disables things and locks you out. And that's one of Nintendo's security measures. So how do we get higher level permissions, if we want to use this analogy? Well, the 3DS has 2 primary CPUs, essentially. Or CPU, I don't know, segments, if we want to call it that. It's got the ARM 9 and the ARM 11. And these are the CPUs in the 3DS. Okay? And to have full access to run any code you want with the full power of the 3DS and use it to its fullest extent, you need access, unlimited access, to both the ARM 9 and the ARM 11. However, it took a long time to get there, and public ARM 11 exploits only came out a few days ago without hard modding and potentially bricking your console very easily. So where did it start? Well, for a long time, it was basically, there was ARM 9 code execution, so, you know, we've got ARM 9 ACE. But I'm just going to cross these out for some, you know, for simplicity of the diagram. We had ARM 9 code execution, but no access to the ARM 11. And that's how it was for a while. And you had to be on certain firmware versions to install this, but I'm not going to go that deep. But then, suddenly, Nintendo caught on to this, and they made stability patches. If you're part of the 3DS hacking community, that's a pretty big joke, is stability, haha, when really all they do is patch entry points. Not only these kind of entry points, but also major exploits that allow you to get ARM9 and potentially ARM11 execution. So for a while, it got harder and harder to get arbitrary code on ARM9, and still nothing on ARM11. And then you get something wonderful called ARM9 loader hacks. The 3DS hacking community is big on using HAX in terms of hacking. And what ARM9 loader hacks did for 3DS hacking, it didn't allow ARM11 stuff, as implied by the name, but it was essentially something you would supplement onto the console that would allow you to install things to the system NAND and run code from the ARM9 processor at boot time. It was after the 3DS starts booting. So something called the NTR, which is the DS emulation on the 3DS, that would run before this happened, before the ARM9 initializes. But when it does, you could run something at boot time that would effectively allow you to do anything with the ARM9 processor once you were finished booting. So you have some permissions. Let's call this level 2 permissions. Just for the ARM9, but you've got level 2. You can do basically anything with that, but you don't have full unbridled access to the entire 3DS and all of its capabilities. So ARM9 loader hacks was the standard for a decent amount of time, until very recently, about a week ago, when Boot 9 Strap was released. And we can consider this level 3, if we want to use this analogy, because we have ARM11 access using this exploit on normal user consoles after modifying. The process for installation became a lot easier, but essentially what it does is it uses a flaw in the cryptography implemented in the 3DS's security to bypass said security, and again, I'm majorly simplifying, but run something truly at boot time before the NTR, before anything. And this allows you to exploit the NTR for personal gain, which means in the future we could have loading of DS ROMs, just like on the DS's with those flash carts, except without a flash cart. It basically lets you run anything from not only the system NAND, but also the SD card at boot time. And this is a major breakthrough for 3DS hacking. This is the most access that, public, hacking tools have had for any console since other than the Wii in terms of Nintendo hacking. And it's kind of the whole reason I wanted to make this video, which is now becoming quite long. It's that, I'm not going to go over the Wii U. This video is already long enough, and I've talked about the Wii U before, and apparently I was wrong, so I'm not going to be wrong again. But it's less interesting than the 3DS. Essentially, what I want to leave you guys with is an idea of what Homebrew is and how it's implemented on certain Nintendo consoles and the way that that came about. So if you found this interesting and think that I actually did a good job of explaining things and wasn't totally boring for the last 24 minutes, feel free to leave a like on the video. If you don't like it, you can dislike the video if you want, but make sure you leave me a comment, tell me what I did right or wrong, and what you think that I could cover in the future. With all of that said, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this, and I'll talk to you guys next time. See you later. Soul Closet out.